Okay, so we're back to Descartes, and we recall that Descartes had a certain fecundity with respect to thinking about methods of reasoning. That seems to have been his gift, and he came up in the area of philosophy with the method of radical doubt, and that consists in finding a reason to doubt as many of your beliefs as possible, right? And like literally all of them, if you can do it, and if you find a good technique for bringing as much as possible into doubt, you then try to identify a proposition, a statement, a judgment. We can use those three terms interchangeably for the moment. They're not interchangeable, incidentally, but we can use them interchangeably for the moment. And you try to find, maybe I should just tell you what those are. A statement is a linguistic entity when you say something about something. For example, Jack cut the bread, okay? Or the bread was cut by Jack. Those are two distinct statements. Jack cut the bread and the bread was cut by Jack. They say the same thing, so there's the same proposition behind them, right? That's the difference between a statement and a proposition. Now, judgment is when you actually assert or affirm that the statement is true, okay? So that's so when you affirm, yes, Jack did cut the bread. That's true. That takes the statement and produces a judgment. So you have the proposition, which is the meaning content behind the statement, and which is common to multiple statements. You have the statement, which is the actual precise linguistic entity in the order with words set in the order in which they're set, period. And then you have the judgment, which takes the statement and is an act, involves an act of affirmation. Okay, good. So once you apply the method of radical doubt, what you do is you try to find, if you like, a statement with this background propositional content. You try to find a statement which you can't but hold to be true, which you can't but affirm in a judgment. A statement that resists all efforts to doubt it, so that you have to affirm that it's true. That's the basic approach. He began with the thought experiment that, well, maybe everything that we're experiencing is a dream. Have you ever had a lucid dream? Some of you have. There are people who tell me that they had a dream that was so darn realistic they couldn't distinguish that dream from waking life. I may have had one as a teenager, but most of my dreams are complete nonsense, right? So I may have had one. Every other one I've had is basically kind of shapes floating around, and the rules of logic are more or less suspended in my dreams. So in any event, the very fact that there are lucid dreams could indicate, it opens up the possibility you're living out a kind of continuous lucid dream right now. But he takes it further than that. We have to take it into the realm of mathematics. Do we have any reason to doubt even mathematical truths? Okay. So Descartes he'll argue that the method of radical doubt does successfully extend into the realm of mathematics. And that's a very controversial thing to say. Okay. So here's his ground for saying that. Now he's going to bring in the idea of that evil spirit, you recall that? It's powerful enough to deceive one concerning even the truths of arithmetic. Okay? For example, 2 plus 2 equals 4. Is it possible to be deceived concerning 2 plus 2 equals 4? Okay, now I'd be willing to bet at least $1 that most of you are saying no, right? At least in your initial reaction to this statement, arithmetical statement, 2 plus 2 equals 4. Really, come on, seriously, how can you possibly get that wrong? But the method of radical doubt, right, requires that we consider this. All right. So the idea is that, again, there is a very powerful evil spirit, who can deceive you even concerning the fundamental truths of mathematics, okay? And that this is conceivable. I'll say that again. It's conceivable that there is such a spirit powerful enough to deceive you about the fundamental truths of mathematics. Okay, so that word conceivable, that's a philosophical word, and we have to look at it and parse it a bit. So in philosophical contexts, when we talk about something being conceivable, that normally means that is possibly true, right? We can conceive of it, right, because it doesn't harbor a contradiction inside of it. All right. So what Descartes is presumably saying is that the idea, let's like reduce this to a simple formulation. The idea or the concept of an evil spirit powerful enough to deceive you about the truth, the seeming truth that 2 + 2 = 4, does not contain a contradiction. Should I say that again? Right? The idea of a spirit powerful enough to deceive you about the seeming truth that 2 + 2 = 4, when presumably is actually not true, that idea does not contain a contradiction. All right. Now, here's the question: is the idea of 2 + 2 being or equaling 4 being possibly false, right? Is that really and truly free of contradiction? Like if you say to yourself, how about this? Well, you say one of two things. 2 + 2 = 4 is false. Is that free of contradiction? Or 2 + 2 = 4 is possibly false. I don't know, one way or another. Is that free of contradiction? It's not even clear that that one's free of contradiction. Okay. I know at the beginning of the course we said that with respect to all statements, we're going to assume that one or the either the statement itself or its contradictory is true, P or not P. That's good. That applies to the whole range of philosophical theses we entertain. But does that apply to mathematical? You know, I didn't teach you a mathematical method at the beginning of this course. I taught you a philosophical method. Okay. And I'll tell you right now, there's a whole group of philosophers, and not a small number of them, right? Not a small number of them, who would claim that once you have a statement like 2 + 2 = 4, you can symbolize that with a letter P, and it becomes absurd in this case to entertain not P. You guys follow me? In this case, you just have P. 2 + 2 = 4, in the mind of many, many philosophers, is like saying if it's raining, then it's raining. Well, that can't possibly be false, because if it's raining, then it's raining, period, right? You don't get much information out of that. Really, you get no information, because you can say if something is a koala bear, then it's a koala bear. Well, thank you. I already knew that, right? You're not adding to my knowledge by saying something like that. Okay. Oh, by the way, incidentally, we do think that we do learn things in mathematics, right? So if we think that mathematical statements, true mathematical statements, can't possibly be false, okay, there is this issue of trying to distinguish those from statements like if it is raining, then it is raining, which really don't inform you about anything. But when you learn that a squared plus b squared equals c squared, we say, on the one hand, that can't even possibly be false. It's true in Euclidean space. Euclid was the first famous geometer. Well, not the first famous geometer, but he was the person who sort of codified Greek geometry. So if we say that a squared plus b squared equals c squared, within Euclidean space, that's a space without curvature. We can't get into that. It has to be true. There's no other alternative. We say that that's necessarily true, and we add that we actually learned something, right? Despite the fact that there's no alternative to it. Okay. All right, that's a little difficulty for a different discussion, for a different class. Let's go back to our problem. Descartes is trying to get us to entertain the possibility that 2 + 2 = 4 could even possibly be false. Here's my question for Descartes and for you. If we call that into doubt, how can we move forward at all? I mean, to question the proposition 2 + 2 = 4, right, seems to pull up a certain fundament of rationality, such that if we go that deep and pull that stone out of the ground, right, one can venture to say we're not going to be able to build anything there ever again. It'd be like as if we pulled a stone out of the ground and everything collapsed and a chasm opened up that went straight down to hell or something. But maybe I'm wrong. Let's continue thinking about this. If you entertain the possibility that it's false that 2 + 2 = 4, okay, how will you ever establish any kind of trust in your ability to reason at all, such that you could get out of this position of radical doubt. You follow? All right. So if we follow Descartes, we have to entertain the possibility that 2 + 2 = 4 is false, right? But there's the danger that if we do that, we're basically tearing up the very fundamental substructure of human reasoning, and we're not going to be able to make any progress. Okay. So, and further along this line of reflection, Descartes silently presupposes the truths of logic. We looked at those at the beginning of the course. He doesn't, it's interesting, he doesn't call these into question. Principles of contradiction, identity, and excluded middle. All right? If he doesn't presuppose these principles of logic, he's not going to get anywhere. You guys follow me? So Descartes, it seems he overlooked these principles of logic, and he was a trained philosopher, obviously, and eventually established for himself a reputation as one of the great philosophers historically. And you can ask yourself, how could he possibly have overlooked these? How is this even possible? Okay. Now, there's another question. Let's say he's not calling these into question because he realizes, though he's not telling us, that you call these into question, you're basically tearing up the foundations of human reasoning, and really you'll not be able to proceed forward at all. Given that he does, as a matter of fact, presuppose these logical principles, do these logical principles actually imply the truths of arithmetic? It's an interesting question. Believe it or not, brace yourself, take a deep breath. 3 centuries later, Kurt Gödel, I believe in 1928, will prove that this derivation of arithmetic from the basic truths of logic can't be carried out. All right, so that these two areas of knowledge are distinct from one another. There's logic as a particular area of knowledge, and then there's arithmetic as a second area of knowledge. Now, despite that, logic nowadays gets treated as a branch of mathematics. But as one branch of mathematics, arithmetic is another branch of mathematics, okay? So where does that leave us? Well, it leaves us in the same place. You know, granted that these two areas of human reason are distinct from one another, okay? And there are technical questions about the precise way in which they're distinct. If that really has wet your whistle there, guys, if you're interested in pursuing that, you'll have to take a course in mathematical logic, and you can pursue that at RIC with Professor Shogenji, who's a master of this material. And at URI, I don't think they have somebody, they don't have anyone in philosophy who can do it, but probably somebody in mathematics. So, to proceed, all right? You see how difficult thinking this stuff through is? This is hard stuff. For Descartes, in any event, bottom of the screen here, for Descartes, it is possible that we are being, for Descartes, right? It is possible that we are being deceived concerning the very boundary separating the possible from the impossible. Like, it seems to us that it's impossible that 2 + 2 could equal anything but 4, but it's possible we're being deceived about that, and so therefore it's possible that we're being deceived about the very boundary separating the possible from the impossible. Sorry, these formulations get a little involved. We're being deceived concerning, or it's possible we're being conceived concerning what is and what is not self-contradictory. So now, putting logical axioms to one side, if it's true that we're being deceived, or it's possible we're being deceived concerning what is and what is not self-contradictory, if that's true, really, guys, what hope can there be for the possibility of knowing anything at all, let alone the existence of the external world? All right? And we can push this in the other direction. If it's really rational for us and reasonable for us to, if it's really reasonable for us to entertain doubt concerning 2 + 2 = 4, then why isn't it reasonable for us to entertain doubt concerning the principles of contradiction, identity, and excluded middle? See what I'm saying? And if we entertain doubt concerning those, that's the end of our inquiry. It all just goes up in smoke. All right. So now let's turn to Descartes' positive argument let's grant that he somehow gets around those difficulties. I perfectly frankly, as philosopher David Shikhyar has been looking at this stuff for 30 years, I don't think there's any way around that difficulty, and his project collapses right now. But you're not required to agree with me, and you have to think things through independently anyway, right? It's nice to have a philosophy professor leading you into stuff. And the final analysis, guys, the way you reason things out, that's on you. You guys get it? You're going to affirm what you affirm, and you're going to do so with or without a certain methodological rigor. And you're going to deny what you deny, and you're going to do that with or without a certain methodological rigor. And with other questions, you'll remain in the attitude of what we call formal skepticism. You'll say, well, I don't know. It's either true or false. I need to investigate the matter further. Okay? All right. So let's look at Descartes' cogito argument, just granting for the sake of argument he can get this far. So here's the line of reflection. Every time one doubts that sensed experience and mathematics are true, it follows with necessity now that you yourself are actually at that moment doubting. That's it. Okay? So go ahead and doubt that 2 + 2 = 4. Well, how does that occur? That occurs only if and only if there's an entity doubting. Well, I should say, yeah. No, only if. That was wrong. If you are doubting that 2 + 2 = 4, that occurs only if, okay, got to get the logical operator right, only if you are an actual entity engaged in the act of doubting. All right. Likewise with seeing red. If you're seeing red, it is necessary that red is appearing to you, even if it might, in some sense, not be a property of an external thing at all. All right. Well, he'll actually conclude that later, that red is not, color is not a property of external things. It exists merely in our minds. So doubting is a form of thinking. This is how he puts it. Okay, it seems reasonable enough when you doubt something that is one specific act of thinking, a specific act of your intellect. You guys get that? Okay. So what happens when you're doubting? You're entertaining a proposition, and you're entertaining the possibility that it is false. What else is doubt? You know, some of you are thinking is a kind of a feeling that accompanies doubting. Well, take the feeling out. Who cares if the feeling's there or not? If you are entertaining that a proposition is false, you're doubting it. That's what counts. So philosophers sometimes can look a little bit like cold fish. We kind of like try to push feelings to the side as much as possible because they tend to muddy thinking. So hence, every time one doubts, it is evident, right? It is an evident reality that one is thinking, and equally evident that one exists. So that every time one doubts, the statements I am, I exist are necessarily true. You guys follow? So very good. So for Descartes, this is his way out of the cul-de-sac. He found one proposition, I exist, right, which itself, I exist, which itself resists, rhymes with exist, resists the effort to doubt it. Because if you doubt it, you, as it were, at that moment, through your act of doubting, provide the overwhelming evidence that the contrary is true. Okay, that I exist is true. Okay, and I shouldn't. Let me put that again. If you doubt I exist, right? If you can entertain the possibility that I exist is false, at that very moment, in doubting that proposition, you provide over the evidence which is sufficient to make that statement true with necessity at that moment. That's the key. Okay? That statement becomes necessarily true at that moment in virtue of its relationship to your act of thinking, which, as it were, confers truth upon that statement. Okay. So note that for Descartes, one's own existence is given immediately in the act of thinking. One does not reason. This is very important. He doesn't reason this out this way. He doesn't say, if I am doubting, then I exist. I am doubting, therefore I exist. No, rather, one immediately intuits one's own existence along with the immediate experience of thinking. Okay? This turns on the intuition and again, I use this word evidence, the evidence which being given in the present moment on its own, right, makes a certain statement true, namely the statement, I exist. It has to be true so long as the evidence is present and the statement, I exist, bears a relationship, a real relationship to that evidence, which as evidence makes that statement true, period. Okay, hope that makes sense. So there's a certain kind of theory of evidence in the background here, which he hasn't revealed to us, but here it is. And the theory of evidence is, it's going to come out later, but the theory of evidence is that there is a certain class of evidence which is so utterly clear that it makes certain statements necessarily true in virtue of their relationship to that evidence. Okay. There are many people who would deny that, but Descartes affirms it. So this first proposition, this will serve as the foundation for his entire philosophical system. And this is a general application, actually a specific application, of the unstated rule that whatever is given with clear and distinct evidence to the mind will always provide content for a statement that is necessarily true. Okay? If something's given to the mind with clarity and distinctness, that will on its own provide content for a statement that is necessarily true. Okay. Like the word content, a foundation, a reference, an evidentiary datum, right? That will show that a certain statement that refers to it and affirms that evidentiary datum is necessarily true. Okay. So note that Descartes is presupposing that immediate evidence of existence can be perfectly clear and distinct, but that simple mathematical equations are in fact not perfectly clear and distinct because of the remote possibility that there is an evil demon who has bent all of his powers towards deceiving him concerning all things. All right. All right, so I'm going to skip this. Well, why not say this? Note further that in probability theory, which was invented in 1654 by Blaise Pascal, and it's an interest of mine, a genuine possibility that is nonetheless one amongst an infinite set of possibilities is equal to zero. Okay, that's interesting. But there is an infinite number of absurd hypotheses that would account for our experience. Thus, each absurd hypothesis accounting for our experience is equal to zero. Well, maybe it's an all-powerful leprechaun who's accounting for our experience. Well, no, maybe it's an all-powerful koala bear. Or maybe it's something that's half koala bear, half snake. You can go on combining things forever. All right. So if the evil demon hypothesis is an absurd hypothesis, then its probability is zero. All right. So the question is it an absurd hypothesis? I'll let you think about that. So now we move to the next step. I exist, but what in the world am I? Right? Or what in the world am I? Okay, what kind of being am I? So one knows with immediate evidence and therefore certainty that one is a being who doubts, reasons, imagines, feels, etc. So Descartes is the first philosopher historically to summarize these acts of the mind under the rubric of thinking. No one did that prior to Descartes. So he takes acts of the mind like imagining, okay, when you furnish yourself with an image, okay, or feeling, when you feel joy or sorrow, when you feel hatred or love, when you feel fear or what I'll call confidence, all right, when you feel anger or mildness, okay, guys? When you have those various contrary feelings with their kind of the actual feel that you have in your stomach or your chest or somewhere in your body, those are modes of thinking too. So for Descartes, there are really three modes of thinking. There's conceptual thinking, there's sense perception in accordance with the five senses, and then there are your emotions with their affective. Are you guys familiar with that term? Affective, A-F-F-E-C-T-I-V-E, with their affective givenness, that is the feel that they have, right? So you have those three levels, at least. You go into Hindu philosophy or Indian philosophy, there might be other levels, but those are the three that Descartes and the Western tradition talks about. So prior to Descartes, thinking was distinguished from sensing, okay, and the experience of the passions as well. So these things, thinking, sensing, and the passions, which include feelings, appetites, and emotions, these things were held as distinct. Okay. So how does he think this out? Pardon me for the small print here, but he says, I have to paraphrase him. I cannot as yet know that I am a material being. So he can't know that yet. Now, this is the inference he draws. Hence, I am essentially a being that thinks. Okay, now that kind of violates our own philosophical method at the beginning of the course. If I can't know whether I'm a material being, I say, okay, am or not am. I am a material being or I am not a material being. But then he infers, I am essentially a being that thinks. Okay, so how does that work? I have to be skeptical with respect to my own materiality, but I know with certainty that I am a thinking being. And now he introduces this new notion of essence, right? And if all I can know at the beginning of my philosophical exercise here is that I am necessarily not merely existent, but necessarily a thinking being, that I am essentially a being that thinks. So, okay, he seems to rely upon the idea that if you know that something has a certain characteristic with necessity, then that characteristic belongs to that entity essentially, right? Pardon me. Seems to be a back and forth relationship between necessity and belonging to the essence of something for him. All right. So let's leave that at the moment. So he's going to try to bring the body back into it later. So I had all that stuff in parentheses there. You can skip that. So now there's some niceties we should look at, and I've suggested before that Descartes has a hidden agenda in what he's doing. The program of setting up modern technological, scientific and technological civilization. So if it seems to one that one clearly and distinctly perceives the presence of a green tomato, then one must grant that one does not in reality clearly and distinctly perceive its presence, right? At least at this point, at least until one overcomes. Now, what do I mean by EDH here? At least until one overcomes this stage of the argument, if that's possible, okay? But we will see that as Descartes proceeds, he argues in such a way that when we do eventually come to grant there are real spatially extended green tomatoes, he gets there eventually, that he has maneuvered his reader into thinking about them in accordance with a mechanistic conception of the world, which, we'll see this with stark clarity by the end of this exercise, which mechanistic conception of the world rejects final causes, or what we learned about the principle of finality in St. Thomas Aquinas, the final cause in Aristotle, okay? And with this rejection, he rejects the entire Thomist synthesis of Aristotle and Christianity. A little biographical note. Descartes studied under Jesuits, and the Jesuits, they were a relatively new order founded in the first part of the 16th century under St. Ignatius Loyola, and they produced a whole series of almost larger than life figures like St. Francis Xavier, who traveled the entire world and converted thousands of people, including in China and Japan, and Saints Francis Borgia and St. Canisius, who was prolific author, and Vieira, who was sort of the patron saint in a way of, not officially, but sort of the founder of the Catholic Church after a fashion in Brazil, okay? And these persons studied the philosophy of St. Thomas Aquinas, and they made it foremost in their curriculum. And they were really the first order to do that up until about, let's think about this for a second. Up until about the time the Jesuits start teaching Thomas as their go-to philosopher and as providing the textbooks for educating people in philosophy and theology. Before that, the major textbook in Catholic universities was The Sentences by Peter Lombard, Lombard, Peter the Lombard, gentleman from Lombardy, right, France. Okay, and Thomas Aquinas himself has a commentary on Peter the Lombard's or Peter Lombard's sentences. You had to have a commentary on Peter Lombard's sentences in order to be a university professor, right, at that time. Okay, so his idea, what he's doing is trying to kind of do an end run around Thomism and its principle of finality in favor of a mechanistic principle, a mechanistic conception of the world. All right, so towards this end, he introduces his idea of matter as extension. No one had ever said anything like this prior to René Descartes. This is his innovation. We will get to the conclusion that extendedness, it belongs or marks out the very essence of matter. All right. So as a seemingly incidental distinction, Descartes introduces that between primary and secondary qualities. So what are primary qualities? Number, shape, and motion. Okay? And these are the kinds of qualities which physicists deal with. Secondary qualities include color, taste, temperature, roughness and smoothness, smells, and sounds. Okay? And those are the sorts of qualities which are not the immediate object of analysis for physicists. Those are the sorts of qualities that we try to explain in terms of purely physical relationships, number, shape, and motion. Okay? And this distinction was first introduced by Galileo Galilei, who I strongly recommend, or I very warmly recommend you read. A master reasoner, obviously a great scientist, obviously historically important. Okay? You might, you can look at his dialogues concerning two chief world systems. That would probably give you a very good read and a good education. So anyway, so with Galileo and Descartes, we've reversed the Aristotelian distinction between primary and secondary qualities. So we didn't get into the stuff with Aristotle. I can teach you right now. Color is a primary quality. Why is that a primary quality? Because it's the proper sensible of the faculty of sight. Why do you have a faculty of sight? In order to pick out things that are colored. It's the color which is the proper object of sight. Now, of course, there are things with shapes that are colored, but shape is, from Aristotle's point of view, a secondary quality. Why? Because it's common to sight and to touch. So you can put your hand on an object and feel out its shape. You can also look at it and feel out its shape. Normally, we can't always do this, but often we use both senses in cooperation with one another to get a sense of the shape of something. Okay. And likewise, flavors are the proper objects of taste for Aristotle, not for Galileo or Descartes. Right? Temperature is one of the proper objects of touch for Aristotle, but not for Galileo or Descartes. And you see, we can go right down the list. So Descartes now, in order to kind of lubricate the path towards his mechanistic and scientific and physical way of looking at reality, uses what we call the wax experiment. And he uses this to demonstrate the primary secondary quality distinction. Okay, so he takes the wax and then he smells it, has a certain smell. He raps on it, it produces a certain sound. You remember these passages, and he puts it in his mouth, has a certain flavor, and then he melts it. Okay, and its smell changes. You rap on it, obviously produces a different sound. He claims the taste changes too. Okay, so nonetheless, it's still wax, isn't it? It sort of reminds us of Aristotle. Aristotle says there's one nature underlying the substratum, which persists, right? Even though it passes from the privation of a certain property to the possession of that property. Okay, the accidental form. So so far we're not that far from Aristotle, but let's keep going. So Descartes again, he observes the wax persists despite changing literally all of its specific properties. Now that's the interesting thing. What persists is something different from the smell, the sounds it would produce when wrapped upon, the flavor, so on and so forth. You follow? So whatever that is something that is, whatever the wax is something independent of all of those sensible qualities. Do you get that? The ones that we've mentioned. Color, taste, temperature, roughness, smoothness, smells, and so on and so forth, and sound. So then he takes this next step. Once you perform this experiment, your mind will then have a clear and distinct apprehension of what is actually true about this, right? One will grasp that the wax is susceptible to infinite modifications throughout which nothing is constant other than this. There's only one property that's constant through this whole thing, and that is that the wax is extended. Okay, all the other properties come and go. The one that persists is extension. Okay, and so he concludes the wax is essentially an extended thing, and only incidentally possessed of a definite shape, smell, taste, etc. Okay, now you might say, hold on a second, I thought shape is a primary quality. Well, it is a primary quality, and maybe Descartes is facing a little bit of a difficulty here, but what the idea is that the thing is necessarily extended. Okay, as far as his justification for making shape a primary quality, he doesn't really establish that here, does he? But he does give you an argument for extendedness being the very essence of extendedness being the very essence of what it is to be a material thing. Now, you might say, okay, once he's done that, he's given us a premise for concluding that these mathematical concepts are primary qualities. Because once we know that something is extended, we know with necessity, there's no way around it, right? That it be one thing or two, like we can have one clump of wax or two. We know with necessity, it has to have a shape, okay? And either it's in motion or it's in rest. So we can say, okay, we take a second step here and show that once we show that an object is essentially its extendedness, okay, material object at least, is essentially its extendedness, then with a little bit more reasoning, we realize that it possesses the properties of number, shape, and motion in its very being, right? So those are those are therefore primary qualities. Okay, I was going to comment on that. I'm not going to go into it. All right, so as far as the other qualities, those don't necessarily accompany it because there are people who can't smell anything or taste anything or see or hear, right? All those are irrelevant. What the thing is in and of itself is an extended thing with these mathematical properties. Hopefully that makes some sense. So now we learn this. If the external material world can be shown to exist, it is nothing other than extension, or as some philosophers say, geometry bodied forth. Okay. Now, nota bene, that's what NB means, note well. Descartes generated his conclusion by selecting a highly malleable, changeable substance. Had he begun with a tree, he hardly would have proceeded immediately to the result that matter is a malleable, extended thing. Right? Because had he taken the tree and burned that up, it would have turned into ash and smoke. And so a good part of the tree would have gone up into the atmosphere, and he would have been left with ash. Not only that, he would no longer have a tree. You guys follow me? So if you begin with wax and melt it, you end up with wax. You begin and you end up with wax. If you begin with a tree and burn it, you start with the tree and end up with something other than a tree. That is ash and smoke. So, in any event, his conclusion is reminiscent of the Milesian materialists, Thales, Anaximander, and Anaximenes. And I have to confess an erratum in my previous demonstration. I think I remember saying that Aristotle was refuting the Milesians. He does refute the Milesians elsewhere, but in the passage we were concerned with, where we introduced the idea of two contraries and a substratum, he was refuting the Megarians, the persons from Megara. So pardon me, I think I spaced out while I was just talking about that. Chose one M word rather than another. He refuted the Megarians, not the Milesians, at least in that passage that we were talking about. He talks about the Milesians elsewhere. All right, so at this point in the argument, there is, number one, the mind, and number two, the appearance of extended things. That's where we are. Okay, so that's compatible with your experience being nothing but a series of phantasms being imposed upon you by an evil spirit. We have not yet demonstrated the existence of the external world, but we have taken another interesting step here. Matter is extended, but mind is the contrary of matter in this respect. Mind is extensionless, right? That's interesting. Matter and mind, they complement one another in the way that these two concepts complement one another, right? And so when philosophers see those sorts of things, they think that they've discovered a kind of pattern in reality. So you have the concept of what is extended, and then the concept, we call this a complement concept, of the non-extended or the unextended. So the complement concept is arrived at simply by taking the prefix non, non, and placing it in front of the word. There's the extended and there's the non-extended. Huh, that's interesting. That's, as it were, kind of logically rigorous way of establishing a conceptual opposition. But then lo and behold, we have independent argumentation, which leads us to recognize that this concept of the extended actually captures the very essence of all material beings. And this concept of the non-extended, or the extensionless, this captures the very being of mind. You get that? Okay, so then, despite the difficulties we've identified in Descartes' argument so far, we can understand why he got rather excited at this point. Okay. So, guys, this happens to even, philosophers who are not going to become famous, like me. You make a certain discovery sooner or later, and there's a certain symmetry and there's a certain order in it. And you start thinking, aha, I've discovered the nature of reality, or one or another aspect of the nature of reality. And maybe you have, or maybe you haven't, right? But I understand. I'm saying I can relate to Descartes here psychologically because, I think all academics have this experience. All philosophers and even academic intellectuals have this experience. But they make a discovery, and the discovery might present a certain symmetry or something to that effect, and then you think, aha, it was meant to be, or something to that effect. All right. So now Descartes proceeds, before looking at the external world, the question of the external world, he's going to try to prove the existence of God. So notice how different his procedure is from that of Aquinas and Aristotle. Aquinas and Aristotle, they presupposed from the get, and it was hard to get around this argument, that if you're forming judgments at all, right, if you're affirming statements and denying them, you're doing so because from the outset you have assumed independent access to reality. And there's no way around that. That assumption is built into you as a human being. The assumption of access to reality is built into your species essence. Descartes has tried to dig down deep enough so as to suspend that assumption. I'll let you think about whether or not he has succeeded at that, okay? But having suspended that assumption, or having supposedly suspended it, he can no longer offer the kinds of proofs for God's existence that St. Thomas Aquinas offered. Remember that St. Thomas's proofs were a posteriori deductive proofs. They were a posteriori because they turned on facts, which we call contingent facts. They need not be, but they are, okay? And they're deductive because they use the techniques of deductive logic to demonstrate that a conclusion follows with rigor and necessity from from the a posteriori fact in question, plus some other premises. Okay. So the third meditation turns to the existence of God. In this, Descartes continues in the tradition. We already have that. Hold on a second. I'll just say this. Aquinas continues to use some of the vocabulary of the Thomist tradition. Okay? I mean, it's interesting he's doing that while turning it on his head. He never mentions final causation, and then when we get to the sixth meditation, we'll see he tries to bury it and kind of exclude it from his philosophical system. All right, so he carries out his proof with three basic conceptual elements: the concept of being, the concept of perfection, and the concept of efficient causation. Okay, now we see a way in which Descartes is separating himself from the previous tradition, because now he's going to use the word perfection independently from and separate from the concept of a thing's end, right? Not to mention a thing's act. He doesn't even talk about a thing's act. That was a big concept in St. Thomas Aquinas. Okay, guys, can we talk about perfection independently of a thing's end? There's an acorn, and then we plant the acorn and water it, and it turns into a baby oak tree. And we can say, from the metaphysical point of view, that's an imperfect oak tree. You say, oh, no, it's not an oak tree at all. It's a little sapling or whatever it is. Yeah, but from the metaphysical point of view, we'd say, if you look at the DNA of that thing, it's an oak tree. But it's imperfect. And then we can say it grows up a little bit. Now it's, 6 feet high. That's a teenage oak tree. Let's grant that. And we'd say it's now more perfect, but still imperfect. And then we wait, I don't know how long it takes for an oak tree to grow up, but like 20 years or so. And then we have this magnificent, tall and impressive oak tree, right? At that point, it's at a stage of perfection. Descartes rejects that way of using the word perfection. Okay. So now he introduces the concept of ideas, right? This is his next conceptual elements. What do we have so far? Being, perfection, efficient causation, and idea. He takes this idea, or pardon me, this concept, this term, from Plato, because it was Plato who talked about ideas, not Aristotle. Plato talked about ideas and forms. Aristotle talked merely about forms. The Greek term for ideas, ideia, spelled the same way, and the Greek term for form is eidos, E-I-D-O-S, eidos. And Aristotle tended to talk about eide, which is the plural of eidos. So, yeah, that's what we need to know. But when Descartes talks about ideas, he talks about them in a broader sense. Now, an idea can include a mental image or a concept. All right. So, products of the imagination are now ideas for René Descartes, and that's in accordance with his broader concept of thinking. So you think about ideas, and ideas can take the form of concepts or mental images. He doesn't say much about emotions at this point, but he has an entire treatise on those later. He composes this later in life. It's called The Passions of the Soul. All right. So he distinguishes ideas from volitions, affects. So there you go. So he's putting affects into a different category here. He distinguishes ideas from volitions. A volition is an act of the will. Affects and judgments. So a judgment, that's also an act of the will. It's the act whereby one affirms a statement to be true. So an idea, a volition, or affect are all exactly what they appear to be. Okay, so that's very important. You know where we are now? We're in what they call the Cartesian theater of consciousness. And in the Cartesian theater of consciousness, we can entertain all sorts of necessary truths, in a way. For example, that the taste of pineapple is exactly as it appears to be, right? You guys get that? Like when you look at an object off at a distance, it might appear to be a person, but actually be, nowadays especially, it might actually be an android or something, right? They're making those. So the appearance reality distinction applies when you're looking at all sorts of objects in space and pursuing their fate, their destiny in time. But when you concentrate rather on the immediate ideas given to your mind. Now, to my knowledge, Descartes doesn't use the term consciousness. He uses mind, but later on, people start talking about consciousness, okay, as kind of a term equivalent to that of mind. When you look in your mind, you can you can entertain the idea of a horse, or perform an act of volition, choosing to pour yourself a glass of orange juice. You can experience an affect, the affect of joy. Okay, you look at a horse while willing to pour orange juice and experiencing joy while you're doing it. Okay, all those as modifications of your mind. Okay, are exactly as they appear to be. With necessity, they can't be other than what they appear to be. Okay, so that's we learned something from that, right? So error is impossible for these three categories of mental content. It's another philosophical locution for you guys who are learning philosophy here. Mental content. We talk about the mind and its contents. That's how philosophers talk about this stuff. But we must set judgments apart precisely because, this is interesting, judgments can involve error. How interesting. For example, if one seems to perceive a mirage and judges that there really is an oasis at some distance before one, well, then one has fallen into error. Okay? All right. So, here's the question. What is the origin of our ideas? They are either innate, that means you're born with them, but they have to be, as it were, kicked into actuality or kicked into activity through experience, education. So your ideas are either innate, for example, the idea of figure, and they have to be innate, right? Because your mind has a kind of independence and a kind of unconditioned activity, and it could only think anything whatsoever if it had access to independent ideas. Okay, that's not a very convincing argument, but that seems to be the direction he's thinking. They can be adventitious. For example, a horse. Well, up until 1492, no one in the Western Hemisphere where we are had seen a horse. Okay, we Europeans had to bring them over, and once the natives of these continents got their hands on horses, they used them just as Europeans did. So here we go. And the third category of idea is a constructed idea. He calls that brought about by me. For example, a centaur. Now, there is no centaur in reality, let's grant that. But you can form the image of a horseman, okay? So he also states these distinctions are provisional, as he does not even know whether any of his ideas are adventitious, okay? By adventitious, he means you're actually caused by the presence of an actual material entity. Okay, let's leave it at that. So having drawn distinctions within the category of idea, he now turns to that of being, or reality. He begins, okay, so now we have this idea of an idea, and now we're going to contrast that with our concept of being, or reality. And now we're going to analyze this notion of being a reality, and then place this analysis in contact with the prior analysis of the idea. So he begins by adducing the idea of objective reality. By this, he in part means relative ontological dependence. There's no N there, but you can add that. What does that mean? Okay. On the one hand, there's what is absolutely independent. What is absolutely independent has absolute objective reality. Okay? What is absolutely independent has absolute objective reality. So he hasn't proved God exists, but if God does exist, then he has objective reality. What immediately depends upon the absolutely independent being has less objective reality by 1 degree. What depends upon beings of 1 degree of dependence, that has 2 degrees less objective reality than what is absolutely independent. Okay? So you end up with a scheme now. If God exists as the infinite substance, he has the attribute of absolute independence. He is the absolute objective reality. And now we can say he is absolutely perfect. How is he absolutely perfect? He's absolutely perfect insofar as he is absolutely independent. And might we say that he exists through himself, right? We'll see that later with Descartes. He's going to affirm that, but maybe we need to think about that carefully. Anyway, he's absolutely perfect. We should ask, what does his perfection consist in? Okay, maybe his being itself, which sounds familiar from Aquinas, and therefore being absolutely independent. All right. So the second degree of ontological, or pardon me, the second degree of objective reality is finite substance. So this has one degree of dependence on the absolute being. It has less objective reality, and so to speak, is perfect after its kind. After its kind, right? Unless affected by privation. So you have a bright red shiny apple. Well, that's a perfect apple, right? So it's perfect in the manner that apples can be perfect. That's what we mean by perfect after its kind. And if there were a human being who never formed false judgments and never did anything bad, everything he did was virtuous, he or she would be perfect after his kind or her kind. Okay. Now there are accidents of finite substance. All right. And these are two degrees of dependence away from God. They have less objective reality, and they're less perfect after their kind. Okay, so what do we mean by accidents now? Because that seems to introduce this old Aristotelian and Thomist notion. But we've already seen that St. Thomas, not St. that Descartes has flipped his concepts of primary and secondary qualities, or proper sensibles, and, if you like, Aristotle called them common sensibles, but proper sensibles and secondary sensibles. That's my phrase, but Aristotle called them common sensibles. Okay. So note that the concept of objective reality ultimately includes more than the idea of relative ontological dependence, as it includes specific properties as well, which are called perfections. All right. So our notion of objective reality now also includes not merely dependence and independence, but perfections, which we still have to learn what those are. So the question is, how is the idea of God, of an infinitely perfect being that I entertain in my mind, how is the idea of this infinitely perfect being possible? Okay. Where do you get your idea of God? What causes this idea of God to exist in your mind? Can I be the cause of the idea of an infinite being, or must something else cause this idea to exist in my mind? If so, what would that be? All right. So now we go back to a principle of causation, which I think we can say with justice he takes this from the philosophical tradition. Here's the principle. There must be at least as much reality in the cause as there is in the effect. Okay? So Aquinas would have to agree with that. He wouldn't differ from that. For example, I mean, an amoeba cannot generate a human being, not given all the time in the world. And likewise, a human being could not generate an angel, and an angel couldn't cause God to exist. Rather, God can cause an angel to exist and everything else. All right? Whether an angel could design and implement an amoeba, I don't know. That's something I couldn't answer that question. An angel couldn't create something out of nothing. That requires infinite power. But maybe once there's matter there, the angel could arrange it in the form of a living thing. Who knows? I'll remain agnostic on that question. All right. So, for example, one cannot generate the force of a locomotive moving at 200 miles per hour by touching it with a feather. So Descartes now adds a second species of being or reality. There is, on the one hand, objective reality, right? We've talked about that in terms of dependence, independence, and perfections. But now there's also formal reality, and the formal reality attaches specifically to ideas in virtue of what an idea represents. Okay, so now this concept of representation becomes important, central actually. For example, the idea of God and the idea of a tree have the same objective reality insofar as each is an idea, okay? But that of God has an infinitely greater formal reality. Okay, let's try to be very clear about this. You know, if you take the idea of God, you take the idea of a tree, you take the idea of a horse, and you take the idea of a car, disregard what they're ideas of. As ideas, they have exactly the same objective reality, okay? But when you introduce what they represent, that which represents God has an infinitely greater formal reality in virtue of that relationship of representation. Hopefully that makes sense to you. So therefore, the order of formal reality is determined by the order of objective reality insofar as the former, that is, formal reality, represents the latter, that is, objective reality. All right, let's get to the end of this existence proof, and then maybe pause and do another video. So here's the key move in the argument. My idea of God has a formal reality that infinitely exceeds my own objective reality. Right? My idea of God has a formal reality in virtue of what it represents that infinitely exceeds my own objective reality in virtue of what I am. So as a finite cause cannot produce an infinite effect, the idea of God must have God himself as its cause. God therefore exists. All right, what do you guys think about that? Did he do it? If he did it on the basis of analyzing pure ideas without considering the existence of or presupposing the existence of the external world. If he just succeeded in proving that God exists, he did so with a pure a priori deductive argument, not an a posteriori deductive argument. Okay? So let's consider some objections. Descartes, number one, simply assumes that his idea of God represents a real object. But that's what was brought into question. We don't know if God actually exists or not, right? So by presupposing that God exists in order to establish the formal reality of his concept of God, he's reasoning in a circle. Number two, by comparing the objective reality of God to the formal reality of his idea of God, he is comparing apples and oranges. All right? Descartes certainly has enough reality to be the cause of an idea insofar as it is an idea. Okay? He can certainly do that. He can form ideas. And if his idea of God does not in fact refer to a real being, then its formal reality is nil. Okay? Because then it would refer to non-being. Though its objective reality would be the reality of an idea, in which case it would have the exact same objective reality as every other idea considered as idea. All right. So, if his idea of God does not refer to a real being, then there is no difficulty in conceiving of Descartes as the cause of his idea of God. A second objection. So in any event, Descartes assumes the result of his proof for the remainder of his longer argument. But he adds a conclusion which itself is used as a premise to prove that the external world really exists independently of his experience of it. So here we go. Premise number one. God is perfect. If God is perfect, then he is perfectly good. Premise number two. So now he's using this idea of perfection in connection with a moral quality, right? Okay, very good. So if God is perfect, then he is perfectly good. Premise number two, if he is perfectly good, then he will not be a deceiver. Premise three, God is perfect, right? So look at the machinery of the logic. He's perfect, therefore he's perfectly good. If he's perfectly good, he will not be a deceiver. Therefore, God is not a deceiver. This is a very big conclusion for René Descartes. Okay, so that was a bit of a workout. So why don't we go ahead and just take a little pause. You guys go make some tea or make yourself a smoothie or do something. Take care of yourself physically. And make sure you come back when you feel comfy, cozy, and then we'll do another round. Be well.